Hello, thanks for joining me today. We're going to be tackling a fairly beefy issue today, which is fixing Verra. Or more or less, what do I think needs to be done to fix the carbon markets? And I am focusing specifically on Verra because Verra is the largest carbon registry out there. So, I want to get a couple of caveats out of the way. The first important caveat is that this video is coinciding with the release of a white paper, and it's called Fixing Verra, a critical analysis of Verra's carbon program with proposals for policy and technical reforms. So this is a 20-page white paper, and it's far easier for you to read that white paper than it is for me to create a video. It's going to take a long time for me to go through all of the points that I want to make in how I would try to fix Verra's program. And so I highly recommend you go and read that white paper. The second caveat that I want to get out of the way is that I did approach this from the perspective of trying to fix the carbon markets at large. The perspective was what needs to be reformed in order for the voluntary carbon market to work. Fairly quickly, I had to narrow that down to Verra. And there's two big reasons for that. The first is that, like I said, Verra is the largest registry on the market. I think they control, at least as of a couple years ago, they controlled about 85% of the market for nature-based credits. And the second reason is, frankly, all of the reform proposals that I'm proposing here are valid for Verra, but if you were to do an analysis of another registry like the Climate Action Reserve or Gold Standard, you would end up with just a subset of these. Okay, so that's one caveat. I want to address a bit more of a personal issue, too, before I really dive in. And that is that I think one of the reasons that I wanted to do this is that I'm often criticized in the carbon markets for just lobbing stones, for just throwing, garbage out there and just being mean to people without having proposed any solutions. To some extent, I think that might be fair. And I think some of the reasons that I've done that in the past, I think there's a couple. The first is obviously that I take this stuff deeply personally. I've devoted my career to fighting climate change, and I think carbon credits are probably one of the best ways of doing that. If I'm being realistic, I don't think humans are really going to cut their emissions all that much. And so carbon credits might be the only way that we can really think our way out of this. And when I see carbon credits kind of misused or, ineffectual, what I'm seeing is the exact opposite. I'm seeing carbon credits be used to cause more pollution than cause fewer pollution. So it gets me very upset at a personal level because whenever I see this kind of behavior, it's a slap in the face to my entire career. And it should get everyone else upset too. Okay, so that's the first reason. The second reason that I often lob stones at people and haven't been maybe as constructive as I can is, frankly, it is easier to lob stones than it is to propose solutions. This white paper took, roughly a year to write. I'm proposing more than 80 solutions here. It is not an easy fix to fix the carbon markets. They are pretty severely out of whack in terms of, how the programs work and the methodologies and, the incentive structures. The third reason is that I think historically, when I have kind of criticized these carbon projects, I go into it with the personal assumption that the reader or the viewer already kind of knows what I think is the best solution. One good example to that is that I often criticize carbon project baselines, and I think inherently I often assume that people know that what I think is the best solution is a dynamic baseline based on matching. But that's not something I always express, and I apologize for not being more articulate in expressing that. Okay, so those are the caveats aside. The next thing that I want to do is talk about the methodology. Like, how did we come to these proposed solutions? Well, Renoster, as a company, has reviewed about 250 carbon projects. And in doing that, we've been taking notes. We've been taking notes of every single thing that we think has been done wrong or, could have been done better. And, we've been cataloging that. And in those 250 project reviews, at the end of the day, that's how we've come up with kind of our set of problems and the set of solutions to what we think the answers are for those problems. So in the actual white paper, we go through a case study of a particular project and how we kind of extracted what we think some of the problems were in that project so that we could then propose solutions for it. I'm going to skip that in this video because Lord knows it's going to be a long video. Okay, so how is this video going to work? Without doubt, the first thing that we have to do is identify some of the big drivers that have led to failures in the past. And I'm sorry that the first third of this video is going to be me poking holes and throwing stones at Verra's methodologies again, but I don't know how to propose solutions without first pointing out what the problems are. So, what we tried to do is identify 6 big, broad categories of drivers that lead to problems taking place in the carbon markets. Okay, so let's just go ahead and dive into the 6 here. The first of the 6 is that, in our experience, methodologies are not designed to prevent manipulation. Throughout many of Verra's methodologies, project developers are allowed considerable latitude in how they develop their projects. They're allowed to submit their own attestations of additionality. Most of the time, they're allowed to submit their own baselines. There's a couple of methodologies that have gotten a little better at that, but broadly speaking, that still represents the majority of Verra's program. They do their own leakage calculations. They do their own risk calculations. They measure their own carbon stock. The problem there is that the protocols are not prescriptive. The protocols don't tell you, you must do this. Go out there and measure these, 100 trees and come back. Instead, the protocols are very vague in how you're allowed to do these kinds of things. And so as a result, the common problems that we see due to kind of holes in methodologies are overstated risks of deforestation, which is, of course, what was covered mostly in the Guardian article, and underreporting of losses that are taking place inside of projects. Because, again, people are allowed to report on deforestation kind of however they want, and there's not a really prescriptive set of rules for doing that. Okay, so that was driver number 1, is that methodologies are designed kind of vaguely in a way that have a lot of kind of loopholes that allow for manipulations. Problem number 2 is conflicts of interest in the verification system. As we probably know at this point, Verra's verification system isn't a true third-party sign-off of a carbon project. Instead, what happens is that a project developer who creates a project goes shopping for a verifier, hires that verifier, and pays that verifier to sign off on that project. This is obviously a conflict of interest because the verifier is working for the person who's receiving credits, and the more credits they receive, the more, money everybody gets. I think one of the big problems is that, developers are allowed to hire verifiers of their choice, and verifiers themselves have a pretty strong incentive to get the verification done as soon as possible. So they don't have a great incentive to kind of really poke holes in these projects because that just means more time and money. And they have a strong incentive to sign off on projects, otherwise they won't get many customers. If you're a verifier and you're really hard on these projects, you're not going to last very long as a verifier. So the second big problem that we have with Verra's system are conflicts of interest in their verification system. The third big problem that we have is money, middlemen, and justice. And what I mean by that is that most of the money from these big Verra projects do not seem to be making it to the people on the ground who are actually making the sacrifices. We have to recall that in most of these avoided deforestation projects, for example, people are making a sacrifice by no longer harvesting their trees for timber or no longer using their land for pastures, and that sacrifice should be adequately compensated. However, industry experts have acknowledged that on average about 60 to 90% of the revenue from carbon credits is lost to these kind of project developers and intermediaries. In many cases, deeply impoverished people are having their traditional land rights taken away from them for pennies on the dollar. And it really comes off as being, fairly similar to colonialism, because these are natural resources that are being extracted from people, and it is almost always Western project developers who are pocketing the majority of the money from those natural resources. So this is a big problem, and this is our third big category that we're going to try to tackle here today. The fourth big category is lack of transparency. So core components of many of Verra's carbon projects continue to be hidden from the general public. These include project boundaries. A startling amount of Verra projects don't even tell you where their trees are, or whatever it may be, their wind turbines or whatever. They often don't include very basic numbers like carbon accounting. There are Verra projects certified for the first time in 2023 that don't even tell you how much carbon is being stored in the trees. There is very little ability for buyers or external bodies like ratings agencies to really dig in and do their own diligence to these carbon credit claims. Project documents, what's more, are often overly cumbersome. They lack standardization. They're often written in very complex or obfuscated language, and they often fail to convey like basic data points such as the number of hectares that have been deforested or the amount of uncertainty around their carbon stock. So all of this has to do with transparency, and I think that we can do a lot better, and we've got a lot of ideas for how we're going to fix that. Okay, so the fifth big pillar that we want to tackle today is ego and attitude. What do I mean by that? In my opinion, Verra does not admit to failure very easily. I don't know that they've ever really admitted to failure, but more importantly, they only react retroactively to problems with projects. And what I mean by that is that really quite specifically, Verra has only ever tackled problems inside of projects after a reporter has written up about it, after law enforcement officials have arrested project developers, or after like Human Rights Watch has done reports. Verra themselves don't seem to be tackling these issues as they're raised at a more informal level. So there's a lot of cases in which, ratings agencies, for example, have pointed out issues inside these projects, and it's not being taken seriously by Verra until it gets written up in a news article. So that's one big problem with Verra's attitude, but I think it runs deeper than that, which is that Verra fosters a very defensive and anti-scientific attitude. They're very critical of anyone who points out flaws in their program. And I think as a whole, what that's done is they've enabled this situation where the carbon markets will blacklist people who are kind of critical of the current carbon credits. And I think, one of the ways that they've done this is by communicating fairly inappropriately with project developers. Verra has a fairly robust history of sending out kind of inappropriate emails to project developers, in defense of their program or in defense of projects. And ultimately what all this does is it fosters kind of an unscientific cult of silence that makes it a lot harder to actually improve the space. So that's number 5, ego and attitude, is the fifth thing that we're going to try to tackle today. The last big pillar that we want to talk about is lack of enforcement. So there's a great many Verra projects that are in non-compliance with Verra's standards. I give a pretty exhaustive list in the white paper, but this, the problem here is that this doesn't seem to result in any tangible penalties. So projects are typically allowed to continue to operate as they normally would, even if they are, for example, harvesting trees out of native rainforests without Forest Stewardship Council certification, even if they've changed the boundaries of their project despite it being against Verra's rules, even if they've sold some of their land to timber companies. All of these are real cases, and all of these are projects that are still going on today and really haven't suffered any consequences for these actions. Needless to say, if you don't enforce your rules, people aren't going to follow them. Okay, so those are the 6 big categories that we're going to tackle, and why not just dive on in and start with recommendations for how we fix these things. Okay, so the first category there was the methodologies are not designed to prevent manipulation. Okay, so what are some of the big recommendations that we have? The first is that all data should be shared. So that includes sharing all field inventory data about how much carbon there is. It includes sharing mapped estimates. It includes sharing training data. And this makes it so that, if a project developer makes a claim about, a particular area's deforestation rate or something, anybody is able to assess that claim and compare it, versus other data sets. A lot of what Verra's gotten into hot water about historically is project developers claiming that there were a lot more, there's a higher risk of deforestation than like what other people have found, or project developers claiming that less deforestation has happened inside their project than what kind of public scientists have come to the conclusion for. So all of this can be kind of solved by just sharing the data. Verra has a great platform today. All they need to do is host more data on it. The second big proposal that we have is to monitor projects annually. So in this day and age, 2024, there is no reason that public data sets couldn't be used to automatically monitor projects for losses on an annual basis. This is tremendously important because a lot of Verra projects have experienced losses a couple of years ago and they just haven't reported them. There's Verra projects that have gone more than 10 years without reporting their losses. Monitoring should be done annually and automatically, ideally using public data sets such as Global Forest Watch's GLAD alerts or Google's Dynamic World dataset, both of which give you an annual estimate of forest cover across the entire world. So that can be done by Verra, and it doesn't necessarily need to be done by a project developer, and we don't need necessarily the pomp of a full monitoring report or verification. We just need to make sure that these trees are still standing. Okay, next point. Project developers should not dictate carbon stocks or estimates. Carbon protocols should be entirely prescriptive. A developer's only role in the entire process should be one of governance. So developers should have no role in measuring carbon or creating baselines or reference regions or risk maps. For example, field measurements could be done by verifiers. They don't necessarily need to be done by developers themselves. Another example is that maps can be made by independently performance competitive environments in the same way as Verra's current consolidated frameworks maps are made for risk mapping. You can do this for all the different frameworks in Verra's program. What I really want to point out here is that this is not a huge departure from the norms. In fact, there are carbon methodologies out there that are 100% prescriptive. For example, the Climate Action Reserve's Mexican Forest Protocol allows absolutely zero wiggle room in how the carbon credits are calculated. You get basically a gigantic database called CalcBosc. It automatically randomly calculates where you need to measure the trees. You go out and measure them, put those numbers into the database, and all the calculations are done for you. So there's no instance in which a human being or a project developer can step in and say, here's what I think the numbers should really be. Okay, next solution is all carbon protocols should be adversarially tested publicly. And what I mean by this is that we should open up these carbon protocols to allow people to kind of run hypothetical scenarios of carbon projects that could potentially manipulate the system. We all know there's a lot of holes in the Verra's current protocols, and even their new ones like VM47 still have holes, like you can deforest native rainforests and immediately plant trees. That wouldn't be the case if there was kind of this public testing process before these protocols went live. I know Verra does allow a comment period, but there's not really an incentive for anyone to sit down and make a comment, especially since if you look at some of the older protocols, people made very elaborate comments describing that a lot of bad stuff was going to happen with them, and they were ignored. So what I would propose instead is kind of a white hat testing environment in which Verra provides grants for people to kind of run these hypothetical scenarios. And it's very similar to software companies today. Software companies, before they launch big pieces of software, will employ companies to do white hat testing, which is basically adversarial testing of their software. Okay, so adversarial testing is the next big solution that we have for methodologies not being designed to prevent manipulation. The next one that I want to talk about is technological innovation. It needs to be supported more strongly and more rapidly by Verra. Using global and public validation data sets should be really accepted. So, we should all accept using Global Forest Watch to monitor a lot of these projects. It's fair to say that, if you can prove you can do better, that's good, but there's no reason that you shouldn't be allowed to do this. And more importantly, kind of the newer technologies that we see on the market today should be adopted pretty rapidly. One example of this is that there's a 2013 meta-analysis by Zolkos et al. that I point to in this white paper that reviewed more than 70 different peer-reviewed publications and came to the conclusion that airborne LiDAR is just as accurate as a field inventory. Great, Verra should have accepted this in 2013. But even today, Verra doesn't really accept airborne LiDAR. The criteria for using airborne LiDAR is incredibly prohibitive, and so people opt not to use it. And instead, a lot of Verra projects don't measure their forest at all. They just take regional averages. So by kind of rejecting this kind of better technology that exists out there, they've kind of lowered the quality of their standard. Verra should be kind of accepting of things that are broadly academically considered to be valid means of measuring trees or forecasting baselines. And that includes LiDAR, and it also includes dynamic baselining. Okay, the next thing that we would suggest is to create requirements around each methodology for producing strictly standardized and repeatable results. This goes to what I was saying before. There should never be an instance where you can calculate for a carbon project a set of carbon numbers and then calculate it again and get a different set of carbon numbers. And yet, under Verra's program today, all of their protocols can be kind of calculated to have enough wiggle room to get widely different issuance amounts. This goes back to my point originally, which is that all protocols need to be completely prescriptive. There's no wiggle room allowed in the protocols. Okay, so we have another couple of specific recommendations for fixing this stuff. The first is that all baselines should be dynamic. And what I mean by that quite specifically is that carbon credits should be issued based on observations of deforestation as the project progresses. You should only be issuing avoided emissions credits or even removals credits based on what you're seeing in the surroundings that year. Some of Verra's protocols are already dynamic. So VM45 and VM47 are both kind of these dynamic matching baselines, but some of Verra's protocols aren't, like VM48. Their consolidated framework is not a dynamic baseline. You're using historical information to estimate what's going to happen in the future, and that's a really risky thing to do. Deforestation should never be forecasted to increase above historic levels. And so, if we're not going to do it dynamically, at the very least, we should not be forecasting increases in growth, which has historically been one of the bigger problems with these deforestation baselines. And I guess it's worth pointing out, you might say the consolidated framework kind of solved this one, but that only tackled unplanned deforestation. Avoided planned deforestation is still a storytelling exercise, and the solution to this is, once again, to basically issue credits based on what's happening in the surroundings, not based on what they could have done if they wanted to. Okay, the next recommendation is that all projects must measure their trees using either field plots or LiDAR. These are, I think it's broadly fair to say, in the scientific and timber communities, these are basically the only two techniques that are considered to be valid enough to get statistical uncertainty to within plus or minus 10% uncertainty at 95% confidence. So, maybe there's one or two others like drone-based photogrammetry that could be included. But what's really critical here is that Verra needs to stop allowing people to just guess how much carbon is in their forest based on regional averages. Because historically speaking, people will pick the higher of several different averages and they'll get a number that seems a little bit too high. Many of Verra's old projects do use forest inventory plots, and it seems to me that that kind of used to be the standard before project developers realized that they didn't have to. The next point that I would make is that all project external data sources should be sourced from independent or academic labs. And what I mean by this is that there are dozens of research groups worldwide creating really good maps of deforestation and land use change and whatnot. These include, the University of Maryland's GLAD lab, they include the European Space Agency, NASA's Surveyor program, the Japanese Space Agency, Wag9 University, Google. There isn't really a reason to allow the creation of these maps by people who have a financial motivation to get a certain outcome from those maps. And so I think that it's very important that we need to kind of rely on these kind of public sources to do this. Verra's new consolidated framework does make considerable progress towards this because they hire contractors to make maps, and the contractors don't really have any financial incentive for the map to say one thing or another. However, the problem still exists for other elements of carbon projects, such as monitoring losses, and the project still exists for things like improved forest management or avoided planned deforestation. It's critical that carbon projects monitor their deforestation using independent, peer-reviewed sources. So, generally speaking, we should probably be all using Global Forest Watch or the European Space Agency or whatnot to monitor how much loss is taking place in these areas, because while they may not be completely accurate in every single environment, they are unbiased. And that's much more important to Verra's program than absolute accuracy. Okay, the next point that we would make is that we think that Verra should financially incentivize the creation of better estimates. So Verra should create a system in which people profit from creating better estimates of carbon or deforestation or whatever it may be. Ideally, this could be competitive in nature. And I'll give you one example of how this was done right. The US government put out a grant for universities to create new allometric equations for estimating how much carbon stock were in trees a couple years ago. Everyone who applied for this grant who was qualified got a little bit of money to start. Then they started creating models. The winner, the university that created the best models, statistically speaking, then basically got more money from the grant, and their models were adopted for the program. This is exactly the kind of incentive structure that Verra could use to incentivize creating the absolute best products. The next point that I would make is that Verra should issue credits based on data and not humans, and I think we kind of touched on this already a little bit, but there really shouldn't be any room in the process at all for a human to define reference regions or carbon stock numbers. Everything needs to be algorithmic, prescriptive, repeatable. The next thing that Verra could do, which would be really great, is to create global validation and training data sets for their programs. And what I mean by that is that they could create, at a fairly low cost, a global data set that is used to train models for estimating forest cover loss or carbon stock. Every project needs to do this, and so it doesn't really make sense for every project to be kind of doing their own thing. If Verra could have kind of this master database in which we're all kind of training our models and all comparing model performance to. It's kind of similar to a Kaggle competition in machine learning, where Kaggle kind of puts out this global data set and everyone can try to do their best to get the best accuracy in predicting whatever you're trying to predict. For example, the United States Geological Service manages a data set of 25,000 hand-labeled plots for the United States for land use mapping, and it is fairly inexpensive to just hire people to label imagery like this. So Verra could do this at a fairly low price point relative to a lot of the other challenges that they're facing in their system. The next point I would make is that we suggest that Verra create bug bounties and community-oriented improvement programs. And what I mean by a bug bounty is that, again, software development companies will pay hackers to basically find holes in their software. And they'll basically they pay hackers a reward whenever they are able to find a hole and report it properly so that it can be patched. Verra should do the same thing. So it would be ideal if Verra could, put out a bug bounty that says okay, for this project area, are you able to wring more credits out of our program by, manipulating the numbers in any way? That would be a really strong financial incentive for us to button up all the holes in the methodologies. Okay, another idea is that stiffer penalties should be applied for uncertainty estimates and biases. So there's a lot of uncertainty in carbon stock estimation that is kind of being brushed under the rug. That includes uncertainties for allometric equations that we don't even consider. So allometric equations typically, they often have plus or minus 50 or 30% uncertainty depending on where we are on Earth. And that's not even being accounted for by Verra. The other thing that we've noticed is that a lot of Verra projects, they're not really counting the uncertainty of their carbon stock estimation in a statistically valid way. So we recommend that Verra adopt the United States Forest Service's accepted framework for estimating uncertainty and standard error in a carbon inventory, and the United States Forest Service has actually put out a guidebook for how to do that. The next suggestion that we would have is that projects should use ton-year accounting to estimate their long-term claims, or Verra should stop making claims about permanence that exceeds the contract length of the project. What I'm talking about is that Verra often claims that their projects are somehow worth 100 years worth of benefits, and I think that their claims are kind of based on this assumption that they'll continue to monitor the project after the after the contract expires, and that they'll go into their buffer pool to reimburse any losses. There's no mechanism in place to do this, and they're not going to do it. For various reasons, their buffer pool is not big enough to do this. But more importantly, ton-year accounting is a really good way of taking a 30-year project or a 40-year project and computing the 100-year benefit of that. And it's really important that Verra adopt this technique if they want to kind of be competitive with a lot of these other programs that are removing carbon for 10,000 years. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to do is kind of just rattle off a couple of changes that we think need to happen to Verra's methodologies in order to, fix some problems that we see a lot. Number one, we need to forbid gerrymandering. So any instance in which people are drawing the boundaries of their project area in a way that favors more issuance needs to go away. Number two, forbid monoculture plantations and non-native species. So reforestation should genuinely be reforestation. We don't have a problem with people harvesting timber off of these forests. We recognize that's an important mechanism for a community and for keeping revenue streams running. The third thing that we would point out is that reforestation projects should not be allowed to take place on land that was recently forested. We do not want these situations where people are cutting down native rainforest and enrolling recently planted trees. And in fact, Verra's VM47, their brand new ARR methodology, does not specify this as a rule. Their old methodology did. So they've actually made their methodology worse here. And Renoster has already evaluated a project that is currently enrolling in VM47 that cut down native forest and planted trees and is trying to get credits for it. The cutoff should be 10 years, and that's the standard for many other carbon registries. Another thing, improved forest management projects must demonstrably improve upon forest management. Improvement forest management projects are not designed to just be avoided deforestation projects. They're not designed to, enroll little bits of land that weren't really at any risk. They are designed to take an area that has historically been harvested very severely and harvest it less. And there needs to be absolute proof in the historical satellite imagery or management plan that this is being done. Okay, next one here. Avoided deforestation projects cannot forecast more losses than have been historically observed in the region. So we don't want to see these projects, estimating future deforestation rates to go up enormously. Verra's consolidated framework does fix that for avoided unplanned deforestation projects, but for avoided planned deforestation projects, we still see some pretty crazy claims being made out there. Next one is that the start date of carbon projects should not be retroactive unless there's strong justification for retroactive credits. And what I mean by this is that Verra currently allows you to set the start date of your project minus 5 years. If I'm creating a project in 2024, I can set the start date at 2019. People are doing that pretty regularly, and there's no justification for that at all because clearly they weren't really doing anything up until today. If it is allowed at all, and I'm not sure it should be allowed at all, it should come with ironclad justification for having a start date that is, earlier than present day. Next thing on the list, if it's an improved forest management project or a reforestation project, contract length must exceed biological rotation age. What we do not want are people planting eucalyptus trees, letting them grow, cutting them down for timber, and cashing in on their carbon credits. That's what people do no matter what. That's the default common practice in a lot of the world. And yet a lot of Verra's carbon programs are basically just sponsoring timber as usual. Contract length should be longer than it takes for the trees to grow. And that should be both for ARR and IFM. And then finally, Verra should disallow the use of long-term wood storage credits in avoided deforestation projects. This one might kind of blow your mind, but technically speaking, you're allowed to cut down trees in an avoided deforestation project and get carbon credits for the trees that you cut down in a native rainforest. This creates a really misaligned incentive where people are incentivized to cut down more trees in their avoided deforestation project, and it's only a mechanism that really makes any sense in reforestation or IFM contexts. Okay, so those are the quick rule sets that we would propose to fixing Verra's methodologies, although obviously there's a lot of littler ones as well. So congratulations, guys. We've made it through our first driver that we wanted to tackle here. We've made it through how methodologies themselves are not designed to prevent manipulation. Let's now move on to issue number 2, which is conflicts of interest and flaws in the verification system. So, we have a couple of big general recommendations here, and our first and most important recommendation is that verifiers should not be selected by project developers. Verifiers should be selected randomly out of a global pool of qualified candidates by Verra. Maybe there are some qualifications that say, okay, I can only verify projects in the United States. That's fine, but it should be selected randomly. And I'll give you an example of when this is done properly. In the United States judicial system, judges are selected usually at random out of a pool, and they're drawn after precluding potential conflicts. So, if the U.S. can select its judges randomly, then Verra can select its judges randomly as well. The second recommendation that we would make is that verifiers should be employed out of a global verification pool. So the money to pay a verifier should come out of a pool that projects contribute to. and they should not be paid by project developers. This pool can be funded by funds very similar to a buffer pool. We can do a couple of quick calculations to figure out what every project's contribution is going to be. Obviously, if it's a project that's harder to verify, it needs to have a higher contribution. But this really eliminates any conflicts of interest in who the verifiers are working for. Once again, there is precedent for this. Open Forest Protocol, for example, does not allow project developers to select their verifiers. And once again, Open Forest Protocol randomly selects verifiers from a pool, and it pays them through this fairly complicated crypto thing, but it's basically paying them out of a pool that is independent of the actual project that's being verified. So that's really important to break this kind of conflict of interest in the verification system. The next really important point that we would make to fixing Verra's verification system is that verifiers should verify based on core principles, not based on methodologies. All verification should be done to kind of to a higher set of standards, to kind of first principles. So this includes the ICVCM's core carbon principles or Verra's own VCS ideals. However, what's being done right now is that verifiers are only looking to see if they check off the boxes in the rule sets, and in doing so, they're kind of missing the forest through the trees. So verifiers should have broad latitude to fail carbon projects based on broader concepts of additionality, equity, baseline assumptions. If a verifier sees that less than 5% of the revenue is being returned to a project on community land, they should be able to fail that. I think that's me doing a stamp mark of a fail. Verra's verified carbon standard has a number of stated principles about additionality, about transparency, and while they don't go into great specifics, those are the principles that should be used as a higher standard for verification. And so we'd end up in this situation where, no project developer could argue, oh, well, it was technically not against the rules at the time. For example, gerrymandering, people will often argue, oh, well, it's not against the rules, but it's certainly against the principles that Verra has committed for itself. Okay. The next point that we would make is that Verra themselves should build a better internal capacity to vet verifiers and review their own projects. I'll be frank, Verra does not have that many qualified scientists on their team. They consist mostly, in my perspective, of lobbyists, or kind of, I don't even know what they are. Verra should really be an organization that employs quite a lot of scientists to rigorously test their own projects and their own protocols. It's not clear to us that Verra really has the foreknowledge of these problems as they're breaking. It seemed crazy, but it doesn't seem as if Verra really even knows that these problems exist until a qualified scientist writes up an article about what's going on inside these areas. The next recommendation that I would have is Verra should mandate third-party insurance. And I can't stress enough how important this is. It's one of the more important points that I'm going to revisit at the end of this whole thing. Third-party insurance providers can provide a quality assurance backstop to carbon credits, and they have a strong financial incentive to only insure high-quality projects. So if Verra mandated that all their carbon credits needed to have insurance, then all of a sudden all these carbon credits would have to demonstrate to insurer that they're good. It would do two things. The first thing that it would do is it would provide an off-ramp for extremely high-risk projects. Believe it or not, there is no rule in Verra's program today that forbids extremely high-risk projects from taking place. Projects that are at extreme risk of deforestation or fire, you're still allowed to enroll, and there's nothing that Verra can really do to stop you. That includes projects in places like Cambodia, where the government has over and over again made very clear that they don't care about these projects. It includes projects in places like Eastern Oregon, where fire over the course of many decades is a near certainty. So having an insurance provider say, okay, we're not going to insure this project, would prevent that. And the second thing it would do is it would improve project quality. And it would improve quality for the same reason that mandating car insurance improved car safety, 40 or 50 years ago in the United States, which is that insurers are just not going to insure high quality or low quality projects. Okay, so we have some more specific recommendations now. One of these recommendations that we have is for Verra to create a hierarchical verification system. And what I mean by that is that each verification should be conducted maybe in detail by one verifier, but then maybe those results should be presented and reviewed and voted on by several others. So we're not saying like verify every project 3 times. Instead, what we're saying is verify the project once, but then bring those results to a pool of verifiers who could maybe point out things that are good or bad. Once again, I would point to Open Forest Protocol's methodology, which creates a pool of verifiers who then vote up or down whether or not they want to accept the project, and fixes can be made if needed. The next kind of more detailed point that we would make is that verifiers should be incentivized to find problems. Right now, I've known a lot of verifiers. They're incentivized to get their verification done as quickly as possible. Quite often, verifiers will hire subcontractors whose only goal in life is to scream through those trees and get them measured as quickly as possible and then move on. They don't want to come across problems. If a verifier comes across a problem, that means their verification takes, instead of 2 weeks, it takes 3 weeks. Well, that's really bad. So the verifier is currently not financially incentivized to find any problems in these projects. But we recommend a strategy in which potentially verifiers could get paid or earn bonuses based on finding problems that could lead to overissuance. And then finally, we recommend that Verra should explore revenue streams beyond the per credit issuance fees. And I know this is a difficult, thing to tackle, but there are other carbon registries, and I think it's Isometric is one example, that have different ways of collecting fees other than by collecting fees per credit. So maybe these fees are per project, maybe it's per hectare, maybe it's a % of the revenue in terms of investment, or maybe it's a % of the money earned after the first level trade of the carbon credits. All of these are just kind of ideas that we're spitballing, but I think historically kind of reporters have pointed out quite rightly that Verra's current revenue stream, they earn more money by printing more credits. Okay. So that handles conflicts of interest and flaws in the verification system. Our next big category that we want to talk about is money, middlemen, and justice. Now, this one's going to be an easy one because we have one of the most important things right here is this first bullet point. Verra should create a minimum benefit sharing requirement for projects in which human beings live inside of them. So we recommend it to be a minimum of 50%. We note that Plan Vivo is another registry that has a minimum of 60% revenue sharing. And I think there's some other registries out there that also have this minimum. Obviously, this is to tackle the really bad issue of these projects taking place on community land with deeply impoverished people and their natural resources being taken from them and them not even being fully aware what these credits are worth and them getting pennies on the dollar. So, for example, in Kariba, it's quite possible that South Pole earned something like $250 million, and it appears as if they returned less than $10 million to the communities after all was said and done. In helping this take place, we highly encourage Verra to encourage others to create third-party trusts that have a fiduciary obligation to ensure revenue sharing. So ideally, like every project that had more than 1,000 people living inside of them should maybe have a third-party trust with a fiduciary requirement to share some proportion of that revenue. That would be a very reasonable regulation that Verra would put in place to ensure that revenues were actually making it to the ground. The next thing that we would propose is that every project that is taking place on public land or has human beings living inside of them should have their entire budget open to the public, and all of the claimed co-benefits should be made public for people to audit. There's no reason for these projects taking place on community lands not to share their budgets. Every single dollar should be accounted for inside these projects and reported on publicly. Ideally, Verra can create a standardized set of budget templates that projects can use to report on their budgets. We would point out that there are quite a few Verra projects that do this. The TIST program does this, for example. I think we point a couple of other projects in the white paper that also do this. So it's not infeasible, and it's actually quite required in order to ensure that this money isn't being squirreled away by some Swiss billionaire at South Pole. I don't know if I'm going to edit that bit out or not. Okay. So we have a couple of more specific recommendations. One of our specific recommendations is that all first-level trades of carbon credits should be reported on. So project developers should report how much they have sold their carbon credits for when the first trade happens post-issuance. And the reason for this is important is that project developers have sometimes used third-party, basically shell companies to kind of hide their trading. And by doing so, they're basically hiding the revenue that they're funding to communities. I know this is a complicated situation, but for example, with Kariba, South Pole used a shell company, Carbon Green Investments, in which they were basically paying that shell company like $1 a ton, well below market value, for the credits, and then reselling the credits at market value, I don't know, like $8, $9 a ton. And in doing so, they were able to say, we return 30% of the revenue to communities. Well, it ended up being 30 cents instead of 30% of the $9. So this is why we need a little bit more transparency in these first level trades so that everyone can recognize what these credits are actually worth, including the people who are living inside these projects. The next recommendation that we would have is to conduct random public interviews with people inside these projects. This should be a normal part of the verification system, regardless of CCB stamps or other advocate stamps and stuff. It should just be a normal part of any auditing system. And those interviews should be made public, and they should be conducted at random by a verifier, not by a project developer. Interviews should assess a couple of things. It should assess the people's understanding of the carbon project. It should assess the people's understanding of the value of the timber and the value of the carbon credits. It should assess the people's understanding of the value of their land, and it should assess their overall satisfaction with benefit sharing inside of the project. So this would really ensure that people are happy with the outcomes of these projects, and that people really understand that sometimes there's hundreds of millions of dollars on the line, and maybe they're getting $1 million thrown their way, but that doesn't really justify the trade. Okay. The next recommendation that we would have is for Verra to create an online forum for complaints. This should be kind of maybe a registration-free forum, or maybe a forum in which people can register if they've received like a little card from Verra saying you're an enrollee in the project. One of the reasons why this is so important is that grievances right now are directed through project developers. So, you know, in some of the worst cases, like let's say Kasingau, where there was sexual assault happening quite a lot inside the project, being committed by the project developer, there was no grievance mechanism. Nobody could complain about the sexual assaults that were going on inside the project because they'd be complaining to the people who were committing these crimes. It's tremendously important that grievance mechanisms should not pass through project developers or operators, and instead should, you know, be rerouted directly to Verra, and ideally be made public in some sort of public forum. This is really, I mean, in case it's not clear, this is important to avoid the possibility of retaliation or intimidation, in which there are numerous cases existing already in the Red Plus program of people who have come forward. The last recommendation that we have to fix, you know, problems around money, middlemen, and justice is direct payments to land members or community members should take preference over all other community co-benefits. There is nothing better than paying people for the value of their resource and deciding how they want to invest that money into their community. Special attention and requirements should be constructed to ensure that more projects provide direct cash payments to people, and that those cash payments are tracked. Ideally, those should be made public. We can envision maybe doing it with a blockchain or something, but it doesn't need to be done with a blockchain. And in fact, I again point to the TIST program that makes direct payments to over 100,000 farmers enrolled in their program, and it tracks it in a gigantic Excel file, which is fairly difficult to follow, but it is all completely transparent, and you can be completely certain that people got paid from their participation in that program. So direct payments are the highest form of co-benefits, and we would strongly recommend Verra kind of trying to incentivize that or encourage that over these other types of co-benefits that are often a little bit more nebulous, like beekeeping lessons or community gardening lessons or job training lessons. Okay guys, we're more than halfway done. The next issue that we're going to tackle is a lack of transparency. So our first solution to this is pretty obvious, which is that all elements of all carbon projects should be made public. That much is obvious at this point. I mean, I understand privacy concerns. I'm not necessarily saying release the names of people living in these projects or their addresses, but absolutely everything else. All of the carbon calculations, all of the maps, all of the geospatial data, the budgets. This should be part of carbon crediting. You are creating carbon credits and claiming to the entire world that you're doing a service for the environment. That should be auditable. Okay, our next suggestion is that the entire budget for the projects, should be made public, especially if any co-benefits are going to be claimed. Now, I understand a private landowner not necessarily making that budget public, okay, but if it's on public land or if co-benefits are being claimed, we need to see the receipts. Because at this point, I mean, it's just been so many cases in which these co-benefits are not actually materializing after the claims have been made. I guess we would also point out that carbon calculations also need to be shared. This should be shared in the form of standardized spreadsheets. So Verra should put out very standardized sets of documents that projects can fill out so that we can all see exactly how the accounting was done. Once again, I would point to the Climate Action Reserve's Mexico Forest Protocol, in which for every single project, the database used to calculate the carbon stock, called CalcBosc, is made public, so we can see exactly where those numbers came from. I would also point to Verra's own program. In some of Verra's projects, all of this stuff is made public. So the Salume project, VCS1122, makes all of its carbon calculations public in a set of spreadsheets, and this should be the standard for all projects. Field plots should also be shared. So all carbon measurements should be shared. There's a number of protocols that require this. This includes the Climate Action Reserve. It includes Open Forest Protocol, both of which require you to measure trees on plots, or maybe with LiDAR, and share those measurements so that people can actually be certain that those trees exist. The use of the buffer pool must be publicly disclosed. And I could go on quite a bit about this, but I think right now it's important to note that when something goes wrong in these carbon projects, Verra does not admit the use of a buffer pool. In fact, I think that there was a recent study that included over 9,000 carbon projects, not just on Verra, across the entire platform, or the entire carbon market. They were only able to find 20 instances in which buffer pools had been used, even though we all know there's been a lot more than 20 cases of projects going wrong. Buffer pool contributions should be made public, and the buffer pool itself should be made public in a very clear database format. And the buffer pool should be triggered automatically for any reversal. Any retroactive miscalculations of carbon credits, such as inflated baselines, should also trigger the buffer pool, and any human rights issues or land tenure problems should also lead to a buffer pool trigger that should be made public. Peer-reviewed scientific literature that analyzes specific projects should also be a trigger mechanism for the buffer pool. So, if someone publishes a science article that says this project hasn't done what it said it did, then that should trigger an investigation and a buffer pool deduction. And currently it doesn't, because there's quite a lot of Verra projects that have scientific articles written about them that are still active. Okay. We have some more specific recommendations. All documentation should be standardized. So documentation should come in fillable forms that are programmatically accessible. So Verra should just provide these forms to project developers that have nice areas that they can fill out. And when I say programmatically accessible, I mean the form should be easy to read. So it should be very easy for me to click around in these forms and see things that are linked to each other. But more importantly, if I need to access this with a Python program or a script or something, that should be an easy thing to do. I should be able to extract information out of these forms without any problems. All Verra documentation should come with common language translations. I don't mean English translations. I mean translations into languages that human beings speak. Currently, Verra's documentation is written with their methodologies in mind, and are formatted and conveyed in a way that is very difficult for people to understand. Verra uses a lot of technical, legalese wording that really doesn't help anyone understand what's going on. But my recommendation would be that Verra should employ a set of technical writers to review all methodologies, so all of Verra's methodologies like VM47 and stuff, and write them in a clean and scientific manner. So, study the scientific literature and see how scientists are trained to write these things. Equations should be written in a carefully thought over manner to ensure that they convey the math in the most simplistic way possible. And I'll be honest here, a lot of equations in Verra's documents are written in a way that obfuscates what they're actually trying to equate. There are often much easier ways to convey the information. And again, this is a matter of kind of sitting down and hiring some science technical writers to come up with a better set of equation sets. Also important, definitions and values used in both Verra's methodology and in project description documents themselves should be provided in line and concisely. What I mean by this is that if I have to plug in some number into an equation, that number should be provided right next to the equation or in the equation. It should not be provided 200 pages down. Professional translations should be made available by Verra when necessary. So Verra should hire professional translators to assist with project developers in translating to preferred languages. I think Verra does, prefer English as a standard, so they should have translators on staff to help with that. And reading their documentation, it doesn't seem like they do. All of Verra's PDFs should contain self-referencing links. So when definitions and equations are included, you should be able to click on a button, and that should immediately pop you down to where that definition is provided. So definitions should be provided in a concise and readable way, and technical jargon should be avoided at all costs. And I'll give you one example of technical jargon that I think is actually pretty high level. Additionality. Why do we have the term additionality when we can use the term justification? Every human being knows this project is justified, this project is not justified. Nobody really understands this project is additional or not additional. It's this kind of stuff. Verra has its own set of lingo that they should really reconsider from a kind of first principles and human readability standpoint. I would point out that many of Verra's documents today provide definitions and applied values at the bottom of their PDF in very bulky text boxes. And that makes it extremely difficult to read these things because you have to scroll 200 pages down to where it's kind of defined and then scroll 200 pages back up. And this could all be solved by self-referencing links inside of PDFs. It exists. Verra should respond to inquiries about their methodologies. So this is our next recommendation. They tend to only really respond when they think they're dealing with someone who is going to be, giving them money. But, what Verra should do is what all major companies do, which is have a dedicated helpline staffed with experts who can answer questions and help people understand their methodologies. I should be able to call 1-800-VERRA at any time and get an answer as to what's going on in the VM47 baseline. Verra, should provide fillable forms as much as possible. And the other thing that they should do is create enrollment software. So right now, Verra provides a couple of templates, but those templates themselves have a lot of wiggle room. But really what Verra should do is actually create software that produces repeatable results that developers can use to develop carbon projects. So they kind of do have this little software piece to create risk maps. Keep up the good work and create an actual software suite for creating projects that can be, very easily indexed and looked at. And this software, it can also double as a data storage device. So a lot of project developers I know are storing data on flash drives from 10 years ago that they have to dig through their desk to get to. But, realistically what we need is kind of a more professionalized data management storage system, and Verra's software that they developed to help create carbon projects could be the mechanism for doing that. Okay, so that is issue number 4. So the next point that we have to tackle is perhaps the most prickly, and that is Verra's ego and attitude. Where do we even begin on this? Okay, so our first recommendation is that invalid credits need to be removed from the registry immediately. As we all know, many of Verra's old retroactive credits are not valid. We know this because a number of scientists have come out and demonstrated this at this point, And we even know this because you can apply Verra's current methodologies retroactively to old projects and see that those projects shouldn't have gotten as many credits as they do. These credits need to be eliminated from recirculation, and I understand that the buffer pool isn't big enough to compensate for all of them, but at the very least, Verra needs to acknowledge that these credits didn't actually represent offsets. So this includes zombie credits from projects that are simply abandoned, like Tumring and Otter Menche, and it also includes credits from, pre-consolidated framework tabulations that were incorrect. Many of Verra's projects are currently on hold, and I think what's really happening there is they're using this as an excuse to not have to actually refund these credits from their buffer pool. Projects should not be placed on hold more than 6 months, and some of them have been on hold for years. Verra's buffer pool, again, we have to point out it's too small, and it's made up of a lot of bad credits. The only credible option for Verra right now is to publicly admit wrongdoing, cancel its old offsets in a very transparent manner, and publicly admit that these prior offsets did not compensate for buyers' emissions. They should call on buyers to review their numbers and or claims about carbon neutrality in this light and publicly apologize. The only way the market is going to recover is through a truth and reconciliation process that has not happened yet. The simple way to do this would be to apply Verra's consolidated framework or Verra's other frameworks like VM47 retroactively to their old projects to see how many credits they should or shouldn't have gotten. Okay, so I think that's the only realistic way that Verra can move forward and retain integrity in this market. The next recommendation that I would have around Verra's attitude and ego is that Verra should stop inappropriate communications with project developers. Verra maintains a very close-knit relationship and community with top project developers and other market actors, such as brokers. These are people that Verra are ostensibly supposed to be regulating. So Verra's role in this marketplace is to regulate project developers and make sure that they're doing the right thing. But this include, Verra often will, for example, send around mass emails warning project developers of upcoming criticisms. For example, Verra sent a wave of mass emails warning all of their project developers of the Guardian article and of the New York Times or the New Yorker article about Kariba. In our opinion, these types of communications are inappropriate and they represent a conflict of interest, and they also violate professional norms. So Verra needs to really reconsider how they're interacting with their project developers, and maybe I'll take this on a more personal level. I have seen some of the emails that Verra's employees have sent around to market actors about myself. They are scathing, and I think maybe, I don't think they should have sent emails like that to project developers in the first place, but they can be quite personal in their criticisms. And it's not like my feelings get hurt, but obviously what's happening here is that Verra is kind of creating this very close-knit community where they can blacklist people who they don't want, involved. This includes reporters. And so that really fosters this ecosystem where there's this insider-outsider mentality that makes it really impossible for us to provide constructive criticism. So Verra needs to kind of look back. And I acknowledge that a lot of the worst stuff happened under the old regime, under David Antonoli, who's no longer there, and under his head of media, who, again, is no longer there. So maybe this behavior is curtailed a little bit, but I'm putting it out there. Verra itself needs to foster a self-critical company ethos. So science is all about disproving yourself. That's the entire role that a scientist has. Is disproving one's own hypothesis to demonstrate the null. Fostering this attitude will improve both projects and protocols. We would encourage strongly Verra to admit when failure occurs and simply apologize. Everyone would take Verra's program more seriously if they simply apologized for mistakes that were made in the past And it looks quite bad when they're still supportive of projects that we all kind of can see are not that great, or when they're kind of doubling down on their claims. Verra admitting failure every once in a while, or apologizing every once in a while, would go a very long way towards restoring faith in Verra's independence. What people I think are very angry at buying carbon credits that weren't all that good, and I think that simply admitting that they didn't get it right and that they're sorry for that would really go a long way towards rehabilitating the carbon markets. Verra should attend scientific conferences and solicit feedback from the scientific community. These include conferences like the American Geophysical Union, ForestSat, Silver Laser, the Ecological Society of America, many, many more. We acknowledge that Verra attends many policy conferences like COP and GreenBiz, but these are not the same as science conferences, and climate scientists, as far as I can tell, are really not being given a say in how Verra's program could work. And what's really frustrating is that climate scientists are discussing the voluntary carbon markets. They know about it, they know about the problems, and they regularly discuss at these conferences what needs to be done to fix them. I'll give you an example. The American Geophysical Union, which is broadly considered to be the world's largest scientific conference, there are 30,000 scientists in attendance, and last year there were numerous panels held on the voluntary carbon markets. There was not a single representative from Verra or any of the other registries at those panels, or even at the conference. There were a couple of industry players at the conference. I saw Silvera, I saw Seatrees, obviously Renoster, but those movers and pushers in the carbon markets weren't there. And so we're very concerned that Verra doesn't really seem to be soliciting feedback from the scientific community about its programs. Verra should provide science grants for periodic review of their systems. Those grants should be applicable to academic institutions or to auditing agencies with experience in the specific domain of interest. So those grants can cover all kinds of work, including things like this type of work that Global Forest Watch does, but made more specifically tailored to the voluntary carbon markets. Academics don't require that much money. You could toss them a couple $100,000 and you'll get amazing results about like dead wood decay rates that could really improve your program. Okay, the next point I think is fairly important to me, which is that when Verra refers to stakeholders, what they should be referring to are those who have the greatest stake in solving climate change. I think right now, when Verra refers to stakeholders, what they're really referring to are project developers. Project developers are not stakeholders in making Verra's system work. Project developers are stakeholders in getting the most credits. Verra prides itself on holding consultations with stakeholders, but again, these are project developers that we're talking about. And in our experience, these are kind of invitation-only meetings that don't include those who really have the biggest stake in making sure climate change doesn't get worse. We would note that many of these parties don't have a vested interest in the highest quality carbon offsets. Project developers should in no sense of the term be considered to be stakeholders. They are the folks that Verra are crafting regulations to keep in check, not the folks that Verra should be soliciting about regulations. So, who are stakeholders? Climate scientists, carbon credit purchasers, regulators, and the general public, and especially those who are living or experiencing Verra's carbon credit projects. Okay, so we tackled Verra's ego and ethos. Take another foot deeper in the grave of my career in the carbon markets here. The next and last pillar that we want to talk about is lack of enforcement. And this one's going to be a quick one. All projects in non-compliance with Verra's rules must immediately be suspended. I mean, it should be obvious. This suspension should be followed by a very rapid review process and then a cancellation if they won't come into compliance. This applies to even Verra's small rules, and ongoing non-compliance or suspension must be made clear on Verra's website. So, for example, we want to see big red banners that say this project is currently suspended. I'll give you a couple of examples of rules that are currently being broken by active projects on Verra's platform. Failure to publicly disclose basic project data. So Verra does have a requirement of disclosure of project data, and many projects don't meet that. Exceeding 5 years between monitoring reports. Many carbon projects have gone sour, and their strategy is simply to not ever, report their losses. This should result in the immediate termination of these projects. Redrawing boundaries after the project's been initiated. So there's been a number of instances where projects have claimed they're going to protect this forest, and then they haven't protected the forest, and they just walk back their claims and make the project smaller. This is against Verra's rules. You can read the VCS standard. Failure to show proper government certification or land tenure. I think that Verra has traditionally only retroactively handled these problems after governments have cracked down. So, for example, the Brazilian government arrested a bunch of project developers for enrolling Brazilian federal land in Verra's program, but the writing was on the wall, and this could have been audited before that, and people had pointed out before that there were these issues. This should have led to the project suspension until proper land tenure could be secured. Failure to obtain FSC or Forest Stewardship Council certification prior to harvesting trees. This is essential. If you're going to be harvesting trees off of native rainforest, you really need to go above and beyond to show that you're doing it in a sustainable way and not just tree poaching. There are a couple of Verra projects that are cutting down trees inside these projects, and Verra, allows this, and maybe that's fine, but it needs to be done in a sustainable way, and it's anyway. And then failure to meet Verra's CCB ideals, and I would argue that examples include rampant sexual assault abuses, such as the Kasingau project that is currently still being operated by the same project developer who committed these abuses, or this might also include things like revenue sharing not being adequate, So this is a clear failure to meet CCB standards and should result in project suspension. One good option for projects that fall in with these issues is to simply change the project developer, switch the governance structure. So we don't want to see these projects collapse. A lot of these projects are doing good, but they're not being governed very well. Well, if a project isn't being governed very well, just take it away from that project developer and put it up for auction. Let another project developer come in and take over. And that way we can improve the governance of these projects without having to cancel them. Another suggestion that we have is that all projects in long-term non-compliance with their contracts should face litigation. I mean, frankly, there's a number of projects that have up and sold their land, just backed out of Verra's program and just cut the trees down. Verra should sue these people, and it should be made public that they're suing these people. This is really the only way that we're going to create a program that has a sufficient deterrent against bad behavior in, frankly, parts of the world that are fairly lawless. So we encourage Verra to take a firmer stance on that. All right, we have two more really quick recommendations after this whole rigmarole. The first is that incentives should be given to projects that pay individual small landowners for protecting or restoring little areas. And what I really mean by this is that this is in great contrast to Verra's programs, which have just been getting bigger and bigger and bigger. We're getting to the point where 100,000 people are being enrolled in these carbon programs, and they have no stakeholdership at all. They really don't care what the program is doing. They're going to go and cut down trees. It's much easier to govern and enforce and punish individuals than it is to govern 100,000 people. Verra's IFM methodology for small landowners is great. We love VM45. I mean, it's obviously, okay, it's got some problems with it, but we love the concept of appealing to small landowners and paying people more individually for their good work, rather than trying to enroll entire, countries or entire parts of countries in programs that are simply too big to govern. Projects with 10,000 or more people living inside them must be segmented up. We think that that's just too large to manage as a form of governance. They get to the point where they're so large that you need a small nation's government to actually make sure that good stuff is happening inside of them, and as a result, they're not working out very well. So we really encourage Verra to consider smaller projects. Okay, so we did it. We made it through all 6 of our pillars and proposed all the solutions that we have to fix Verra's program. Woo! Anyway, besides that, I want to leave with what we think are kind of the big points. Because obviously we threw out more than 80 different recommendations here, but some of them are more important than others. So what are the top 10, or less than top 10? Okay. The first is Verra should ensure minimum revenue sharing requirements with landowners and communities. So we think at a minimum probably 50% of the revenue should be shared with communities living inside community land, and we highly encourage Verra to mandate the creation of trusts that can manage this money in a kind of with a fiduciary mandate to make sure that communities get paid. Budgets and carbon accounting data should be made public. In fact, all data should be made public with the exception of individual landowners' names and addresses. Validators and verifiers should be randomly assigned at the start and should be paid out of a global pool rather than paid by the project developer. Instructed to validate to principles rather than just methodologies. So there are a higher set of standards that we need to hold these projects to. Annual monitoring should be done for all carbon projects, and that should be done automatically using these public data sets that exist out there like Global Forest Watch. Wrongly issued credits in the past must be accounted for and removed from the platform. We understand that the buffer pool is not big enough to do this. Everyone understands that, but that doesn't mean that we should just let these projects kind of perpetuate. We need to just be upfront and honest that mistakes were made in the past and that these credits didn't actually prevent the carbon that we said they was going to prevent. Insurance should be mandatory, and the insurance should be done through third parties, and those third parties should have a fiduciary mandate to compensate policyholders when reversal occurs, and they themselves should be insured. And we think that this will dramatically improve Verra's program by improving quality standards because insurance brokers are only going to insure the best projects. We recommend the following real quick to Verra's methodologies. And reforestation methodologies must improve upon industry practices and exceed industry standards for things such as harvest rotations, and should primarily plant native trees. They should not include monocultures, and it should forbid the planting on recently harvested sites. Improved forest management projects must demonstrably improve upon prior management practices and not just improve upon some hypothetical. We should have satellite imagery that shows these people literally were cutting down their trees historically and now they're not going to anymore. And avoided deforestation, including planned deforestation, baselines should not exceed historic averages. They should, basically match or be below historic averages, and we strongly recommend that dynamic baselines be used for all project types. Okay, so that is it. Those are our big recommendations. That is how we would fix the carbon markets. It would obviously be a rough transition, but I think it would be a better situation than what we have right now, where Verra is kind of quasi not admitting that things are going wrong in their program and kind of putting band-aids on their program without really addressing the deeper issues. So a real honest, public truth and reconciliation process that has like a public conversation about how things can be fixed is really what we would call for. And we hope that people take these recommendations somewhat seriously. Okay.
And that's the way the cookie crumbles.